Well, good morning to you. I remember, I'm not sure if I was in Bible college or when I was a teenager, a missionary, came to our church and he talked about how difficult it was to raise up people in the culture situation he was in Africa. And he talked about having a group of people who were eager, who got together, and he was trying to teach them about the life of Jesus. And he could see that while they were nodding their head, he wasn't sure whether they were getting it. And so he gave them a quiz. And the quiz was true and false questions. They gave, I don't know, 10 questions. And the results came back, and he looked at all of the papers that everybody clicked off true to all 10 statements, which, of course, half of them were false. And he said, why did you click them all true? And they said, well, you wouldn't say anything that wasn't true to us, would you? So he realized that he had a difficulty in trying to communicate with these people at their level. I will argue that we try too often to start at too high a level with people. We ask them to jump up 3 or 4 rungs on a ladder, as it were, and they're not willing to start there. We've got to start where they are. And what we're going to look at today is some of the information on how Jesus demonstrated his presence with a very few people. It's so important that we understand exactly what Jesus was doing. In fact, let me start with this. Let me see if I can get to here. Yeah, okay. Are you familiar with this quote? This is Margaret Mead, who is a famous anthropologist of yesteryear. I guess she's passed on now. Her analysis and looking at from the standpoint of cultural anthropology was looking at the people movements of the world. And her most famous quote was, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that..." And you may know of situations from our culture where one person or a very small group of people has stood up and gathered some around them and made quite a difference in the world. Now, Margaret Mead was by no means any kind of a Christian, but she looked at what worked in the world. And what worked was not the equivalent of social media that we have today. I could get upset that I don't have 1 million views to this video, but I'm not going to get upset about that because I know a few people who I work with are going to see this one-way communication. And I hope that with several of my friends who get an email that say, please come and watch this, some of them, very few, are going to get back to me and try to initiate a dialogue on the subject. Those are the people I'm interested in. Not because I'm disinterested in the others, but because it's so important that we understand that we need to follow Jesus. Now, I have said to you that the foundational book that we're working on here is one called The Master Plan of Evangelism. It was written by Robert Coleman in 1963. It sold over 4 million copies, but it didn't make the difference in the world. It made a difference in many lives. But if it had made the difference that Coleman was espousing in 4 million lives, we would have a totally changed world, especially in a North American church. We have a lot of people in North America who think that going to church is kind of like a Sunday obligation, a habit, a ritual, and it gives them some comfort and hope for their one day at a time, but it doesn't give them the readiness to get out there and do what Jesus did. We have within the Gospels statements of some of the things. The books couldn't contain the whole, said John back in the day, but some of the things that Jesus did. And they're the ones that we believe were inspired. The ones that were recorded are the ones that were inspired by the Holy Spirit. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have some overlaps and some distinct characteristics that they bring into their descriptions of the stories. And John adds a completely different flavor, written about a generation after. It was a generation after the events that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their Gospels, and then another generation until John wrote down his. Now, the writing of those Gospels at that time, they didn't have any printing presses or duplication methods other than handwriting. So the original documents were very precious. We have not got any of the original documents, but we do have a fragment I think it's in the British Museum, you can correct me on that, of a fragment from the Gospel of John that's dated back to just early on in the 2nd century, in the 120s, something like that, which could have been a copy of the original. That is to say that if this piece of document, which is word for word, it's just a very small fragment, you can look it up, it's called the John Rylance fragment. You can sit there and look it up and look at images, and you'll see it right now on Google while you're listening to it. But you come back, you're right back here. It's quite obvious that if those words were there, they came from a bigger document. And that bigger document is word for word in the Greek language, what the Gospel of John has for us. How many encounters did Jesus have with individuals, small groups, or large groups? 3 years of ministry, this is what I'm talking about. I guess I really don't want to include his encounters with the shepherds and the wise men when he was a baby. But he had about 160 that are recorded for us. Now, there are many others, and his travels cover about 24, 25 different places that the Gospels record, many of them in the backwater place up in Galilee, where there were about 200 villages and perhaps up to 2 million people. That would work, the math would work that out to, when I say village, we call them towns, I guess. They call them cities. Maybe 10,000 people in a particular place, but he didn't go to all of them. And he didn't spend a whole lot of time in any one of them, maybe 1, 2, 3, 5 days, and then he'd move on. And he'd move on to the next place, and we have indications that he would send some of his followers on ahead of time to arrange for the hospitality. Jewish hospitality was remarkable in its day, and it would be very easy to find somebody who'd put you up for the night and give you a meal or two to keep you going. So a lot of the financial support wasn't, staying in a Holiday Inn Express and paying for it. It was, a lot of it was apparently just by people who were willing to open their doors and take in some strangers. Now, Jesus is working with a very small group of people, and we want to kind of peel into what's going on here. His strategy, which Coleman calls the evangelism strategy, we would probably use the word discipleship. Did you know that the word evangelism is not in the Bible? Evangel is. Did you know that the word discipleship is not in the Bible? Disciple is, make disciples is as close as you can get to the word discipleship. Those words are modern constructs. We've separated them into 2 silos. This is for evangelism. This is for discipleship. My view is that you can't distinguish that and what Jesus was doing. Therefore, it's all one of a piece that we would tend to call discipleship, making disciples. And Jesus' issue was that he didn't say, okay, let's put on the big event, not where he started. And John delineates this beautifully in the first chapter of his gospel. Go and read it. He chose men. He could have chosen women. He didn't choose men. Now, some women were taking care of his financial needs and were traveling with him, but he was focusing in on the men, not programs to put the big crowd together. And yes, he did feed massive crowds at one point in time. He didn't neglect the masses, but he focused in on these disciples who would lead the change of the world and the foundation for an eternal kingdom. Now, the people that he chose, he could have chosen the intelligentsia. He had enough gravitas, we have to assume, by his charisma and his personality, that he could have gotten the attention of a few Levites and maybe some Pharisees and maybe even somebody inside of Herod's house. We don't really know uh, about all the people that were available, but what we do know is the ones that he chose. The largest occupation that they had was fishermen, laboring people, business people, people who ran a small business. So, the first few, he's got James and John, and their father had some hired people, and so we assume that James and John, kind of being heir apparents of Zebedee's fishing business, would have had perhaps some leadership status. And they obviously, as a family business, were making money out of this. When Jesus called them, and his formal calling of them perhaps happened several months after his initial impact with them. We're not sure on that. Various commentators have various views on what happened there. But these guys demonstrated they were impulsive. They had prejudices. They didn't understand what was going on. But they were people who were fat, faithful, available, and teachable. Those are the three characteristics that are foundational that you're always looking for, as Jesus did. Now, he concentrated on a few. In the first year and a half of his ministry, it wasn't 12. Again, we're not exactly clear when. I put it in the front of the screen here. Let me just go back there in case you need to look it up. Mark 3, verses 13 to 19. There's also a passage in Luke where Jesus formalizes the 12, and their names are in there. Now, where was it? He focused on a few. He picked 12. And then of those 12, it's pretty clear from the historical evidence of the about 160 incidents. Could you guess that that's how many are recorded? If I hadn't studied it and figured it out, I don't think I would have guessed properly on that. I would have guessed 100. He was working with Peter, James, and John as an inner three, apparently, and with the 12. And he understood that these were people who could make a difference. Let me come back here. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. That's from a secular perspective. If you look at communism, if you look at democracy, if you look at the American Revolution, you have a small group of people with George Washington and a few friends in the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, Virginia. I actually had dinner in the Raleigh Tavern once and sat at the table, perhaps, that those founders of the American Revolution had. I don't know. We're sure that we were at the same table. They changed their country. And then, by the name of William McMaster, was a haberdasher in Canada, and he started an entity called Woodstock College in Woodstock, Ontario. You may not know this piece of history, and tried to train people for ministry. And ultimately, he became a senator in the Parliament of Canada, a significant man, and has a university, McMaster University, named after him. He was a key leader in Jarvis Street Baptist Church in Toronto back in the early days. And people like that draw a small group of people around them and make a huge difference. And why not you? Why not you working to find a small group? And I'll tell you right now, you're going to have a hard time finding people who are going to buy into what you're saying if what you're saying is different than what they believe. Why focus on such a few? Because that's what the world needs. It doesn't need big crowds to start with. It needs individuals who will stand up, who will follow, and they will follow a mentor if they have a mentor, but sometimes you just got to go it on your own because nobody else gets it. If you look at the book of Acts, Jesus didn't have much happening in the early phase during his time on earth, and he we would probably count it as a bit of just an ordinary thing in terms of the number of people. But after the day of Pentecost and a few short months, maybe a year after that, there were 8,000 people who had joined the movement. And he was training his 12 to reach those people who could move on and lead, if you would, the small group ministry in Jerusalem. They baptized 3,000 people in one day in Jerusalem, and then they followed up, and it tells us in Acts 2 what they did. They met together, and they followed up, and they did stuff. And you can go read it in the latter part of Acts chapter 2. Exactly what they did. And they met together. They ate together. This was a nearness that was created. Jesus did minister to the multitudes. He preached and healed. And when he went to a town, there were crowds that gathered. But he started by just identifying with John the Baptist's revival movement, which was significant, and then picking off just a few from there who followed him. Now, the crowds wanted him, loved him, and they were there when he was on the other side of Lake Galilee, I guess we'll call it that, Sea of Galilee, where a huge crowd had gathered to feed, that he fed. And then they didn't have good planning for it. And so he did that. On another occasion, he fed 4,000 people. So he was popular, but more as a popular anomaly in the society than someone to follow. And he, early on in his ministry, said, "Shh, don't tell anybody," because he was working closely with some people and didn't want to exploit his popularity. Building the kingdom always requires people who are willing to follow. Now, there's a bit of a digression here, and I'm going to come back to it later. And maybe I should have broke this into 2 lessons. But there's a big difference between the motivation that, generally speaking, people have, which is extrinsic motivation. The sign on the highway says you can go at such and such a speed. And you go a little beyond that, and you realize that the police officer, if he sees you, probably won't stop you if you go a little over. But if you go a lot over, he'll stop you. And if you don't treat him properly, he or she will probably give you a fine, and that'll make you slow down for a little while. And following that event, that slap on the wrist, that's extrinsic motivation. When we send people off to Bible college and seminary, we build it around extrinsic motivation. I don't think that that's wise. What I mean by that is you have to put in a paper at such and such a time, or you have to do whatever the assignment is. And so many of the assignments are bound in the classroom where they belong, out where the people are. When Jesus trained people, he didn't take them to a classroom. No, they did have no, I'm not going to go there. I want to go there so badly, but I'm not going to, because John 2 gives us a wonderful story. Maybe I'll do that next week. He was looking to the people who would be responsive, that faithful few who would make the movement work. The modern church today needs to refocus on this. Big numbers don't equal lasting impact. Some churches grow big. Most churches that grow big actually grow by being a magnet from people who come from other smaller churches. The big guys don't like this, say that, and they say, "Oh, you guys who are advocates from small churches, you're always beating up on the big guy." No, it's just a historical fact that people find the big churches, and we've got to refocus. Not to say that I'm trying to get rid of big churches, but we've got to train leaders for works of service. That's what Paul tells us in Ephesians 4. Our job is to get people serving. So if in a particular church you have a low ratio of people serving, you got a problem. Whether that's a small church or a big church, you've got to work on getting people serving, but you've got to show them how first and teach them. And you will find a few people, some of whom may be those who shape the world. Dawson Trotman, the founder of the Navigators, you can go look this story up. It's a good story. He loved to do evangelism. He met a hitchhiker, he led him to the Lord, and then by accident he met the guy a year later and found he'd gotten nowhere. And that changed his whole viewpoint from moving from the idea of just kind of one and done, leading people to Jesus, and then started to focus in on the fact that we needed to train people. I think that, and the Navigators organization is a great organization. They've done tremendous work down through the years. But I think that they tended to not get in at the shallow end with people. We're going to talk about that. But if you get those people who will rise up through the crowds, you can make a difference through your life, and nobody will ever necessarily know your name. I've had the blessing of having started some churches where nobody knows my name because I worked with a key leader who was a pastor of the church, and he multiplied out his work. I've also worked with some who refused to follow up on the people and do the things that needed to happen that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And those churches failed, and I've been a part of learning the hard way by failing, by not doing what I needed to do with the individuals and find out where to go. See, if you look at Jesus' relationships, of the 160-ish incidents we have in the New Testament, nearly half of them were individual encounters. When you add the individual encounters and then the small groups and sometimes the micro small groups, Peter, James, and John of the Transfiguration, for example, it's more than he had with the large crowd. Now, anybody who's leading in a local church and puts in more time in sermon preparation than they put out on the street is failing to follow Jesus. Did you? You put in more time in sermon preparation, you're doing what Jesus didn't do. First of all, we don't have illustration of Jesus preparing sermons. Maybe he should have shot from the hip. We don't know. Maybe he did prepare. He did take time alone. He did take time for resting, and maybe he was preparing himself during those times. We don't know the details on that. But what we do know is that there's nothing that says prepare sermons. There is a lot in the Bible that speaks about getting to know the inspired Word of God and saturating your life with it so that you can spontaneously carry on conversations with other people. We'll get into more of that as we move through this series, and I hope that this stimulates you. If you're spending too much time fixing your PowerPoint presentation and not texting somebody you are working with, then you've got a problem. Okay, now it's time for immediate action in the life of the church. We've got to do what Jesus did, take ordinary people, don't try and get the Bible college graduates. Missions representatives love to go to the missions week in Bible colleges and set up their booths and try and engage people in conversations and get them into their list. I'll argue they should spend more time in the youth groups in churches, just sitting around talking to kids, maybe getting down on the floor with them and leaning on the couches instead of sitting in the chairs and answering their questions, having a dialogue with them. Who you are and how you behave will make a big difference in those young lives. And maybe that 13, 14, 15-year-old, maybe even an 8, 9, 10-year-old will have seeds planted in them so that they can become something great. See, a lot of churches, mission agencies, we say, well, we need recruits now because we're dying. Yeah, well, you needed to invest in people 10 years ago because it takes a while to build things. It took Jesus a year or a year and a half to pick those people he was going to focus on. Lots of other people got the impact. There were lots of other disciples, but we need to reestablish ourselves, not doing what I'm doing right now, one-way communication. This is useful, but it's only useful if it multiplies out, and it will in my life, where I spend time with a few people. I can't spend time with a lot of people. If somebody tells you they're mentoring 20 people, let's take it. I got something popping up all over my screen here. Okay, this This is a general concept here, and that you start with your general church attenders, and you find some people who participate with you, and then you find those who are particularly responsive. And then as you move to the gold area here, you're going to spend some time digging in with those people. That's a pattern that you got to have. Don't invest time trying to force feed corpses. It's not going to do anything for you. So what are you going to do? Well, I don't know that these are actual stages, but they're overlapping things. You've got to sift and sort. You've got to find it. Instead of 20 hours preparing sermons, I was taught as a young man by a really good preacher that you needed to spend an hour in the study for every minute in the pulpit. And I tried to do that. All I did was spin my wheels. And he led me down the wrong track because he was on the wrong track. He was sincere. He wasn't doing what Jesus did. You know, he was a man who, I heard him preach some massive, magnificent sermons on the life of Jesus, but he didn't get up to 30,000 feet, apparently, and look down on what Jesus was doing. And he didn't, apparently, sift and sort. He couldn't have done that if he was spending 30 hours a week on every sermon. You've got to identify the head nodders. You know, some people are, I don't think that's true. And they're used to the big church, the big band, the big music, the big programs, and everything else. That's the ideal. Well, you know, until they start studying the life of Jesus and those 160 events, I've got a chart for you that you can fill in if you want to do that with various categories so that you see it for yourself. If they're not willing to do that, you move on. You sift and you sort. You don't try to force them into anything. You identify that people are saying, oh, now that makes sense. People will say, we need new models for ministry. Yeah, well, nobody wants to get involved in something that's that new. People don't like change that much. So we've got to work with what we've got, but we've got to identify the people to work with. And you go to those people and you take the initiative. Jesus chose the 12. The 12 didn't choose him. Choose him. You don't put a notice up on the bulletin board that says, if you're interested in a discipleship program, fill in the form here. You go and find them. You go and talk to them. You identify the people you can propose a relationship with, and you can mutually set an agenda. If you say, let's get together at 5 a.m. every Thursday morning because I'm busy at 6 a.m., 5 a.m., say, well, what time would be good for you? Well, I don't really wake up until 9 o'clock. Well, if you can work out a mutually satisfactory time, then do so. But, so much of what we attempted to do in making disciples is, it's 5 a.m. That's what I've got available. We're going to have breakfast. We're going to have shredded wheat, no milk, and this is going to be tough. How's that working for you? You don't find those diggers who are ready to go until you build them and you start slow and small. So you agree on a mutual agenda. If they say, well, I can't, I'm too busy. It's fine. You know where to find me. Here's my number. Text me if you want to get together. Set the agenda, whatever it is, and do what I have learned to call checkerboard management. When you play checkers, the other guy has to make his move, and then you got to make your move. You pretty much, if you're smart, know what your move is going to be, but the other guy might be, oh, well, I've been too busy this week. Oh, I didn't get around to it. What with, having to wash the dishes because the dishwasher was broken. That's my last week. There's only two of us. No big deal. I did the dishwashing. It wasn't the dishwasher. It was the frozen pipes, but I digress. You make your move and you say, okay, do you think you can get that done by Wednesday morning? And will you text me or email me to give me a call and let me know how it went? And then the guy doesn't do it. Well, you watch for his intrinsic motivation. Is he stirred in his own heart to do it because he's not saying, oh, bother, my mentor says I have to do this. But he's saying, no, that was a good assignment my mentor gave me. I really need to do that. And they're motivated to do it inside themselves. And if they're not motivated, well, give them some grace and some forgiveness. There's no point in beating them up. But relax the pace. Hey, well, clearly you're not ready to do that by next Wednesday, so like give me a call when you get it done. And they may not. They may never get there. You've got to go back to sifting and sorting until you find somebody who's ready to go with you. Now, those are practical steps. And I hope that you will take them. I hope that you will get a hold of the Master in Evangelism and read it through and study it. Coleman had an awful lot of good things to say. Based on Scripture, 445 references in a very short book to Bible verses. Saturate yourself in the Word. Saturate yourself in the knowledge of what Jesus did. I learned from a Christian businessman who's now with the Lord years ago and worth looking up. I wish I had all his works because he was so wise. Jim Brown, ROH, and he said, I can help 1,000 people, but I can only carry 1 or 2 on my back. And I can only work with very few people, and I only do work with a very few people. Jesus worked with a very few. I don't care whether they know my name or not. I care whether they know his name and live out his life. Well, I want you to pass this on to other people. The people I work with do pass it on to others and use it as a base for their personal discussion. And we're working on building pathways for individuals to break through, starting at the shallow end of the pool and moving forward. Catch you next week, I hope. And it's up to you.